Approximately 300 years ago, on a windswept plateau sitting nearly 3 miles above sea level in what is now western China, a group of nomadic herders made a decision that would reshape the future of an entire continent. They looked at a wild animal that weighed more than 1,000 pounds, about the weight of a concert grand piano, carried horns that could gut a horse, and stood over 6 feet at the shoulder, and they decided to tame it. That animal was the wild yak, and the domestication worked. Today, over 14 million domestic yaks graze the highlands of Tibet, Nepal, Mongolia, and Bhutan, outnumbering their surviving wild ancestors by more than 1,000 to 1. Entire civilizations at elevations higher than the summit of Mount Fuji depend on the single species for survival. Without it, human life above the tree line in Central Asia would not exist. But 400 or 500 miles to the northwest, roughly the distance from Los Angeles to London, another massive bovid evolved for conditions every bit as brutal, the MuskOx. Ovibos muscatus. Nearly identical body plan, stocky, thick-coated, built for cold that would kill most mammals in hours. And beneath its coarse outer guard hairs, an undercoat called kiviut so fine, just 11 to 13 microns in diameter, thinner than the best cashmere, that a single scarf knitted from it sells for over $300 and keeps its wearer warm at temperatures that freeze exposed skin in minutes. The MuskOx survived the Pleistocene. It walked the same frozen plains as the woolly mammoth and watched the mammoth vanish. It outlasted the cave bear, the saber-toothed cat, the giant ground sloth, and dozens of other megafauna species that disappeared between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago. Pound for pound, it is one of the most cold-adapted large mammals that has ever existed. So how did an animal this resilient, producing the warmest natural fiber on the planet, end up as one of the only large herd-dwelling herbivores that humans never managed to domesticate? The answer involves biology, geography, a fatal stress response that kills the animal when you try to handle it, and a Yale-educated businessman from Vermont who spent decades trying to prove the skeptics wrong. He did not succeed. And the reasons he failed tell you more about the invisible rules of domestication than any genetics paper ever published. If you want the complete system behind how ancient humans identified, selected, and transformed wild animals into the domesticated species that built civilizations, I put the entire breakdown into an ebook. The link is in the description. It covers everything from wolves to cattle to horses, the genetics, the behavioral thresholds, the geography. But this particular story, the yak versus the MuskOx, is one of the sharpest examples of those rules in action. And it does not start in the Arctic. It starts on the Tibetan Plateau, with a question that rarely gets asked. Why were the Chiang herders able to domesticate an animal that, in its wild form, was genuinely dangerous? The wild yak is not docile. Bos mutus, its species designation, translates roughly to mute ox, a reference to the animal's relative silence compared to domestic cattle. But silence is the only gentle thing about it. A mature wild yak bull can weigh 200 pounds, roughly the mass of a compact car. Wild yaks charge wolves, gore predators, and have been observed killing snow leopards with a single upward sweep of their curved horns. The herds roam at elevations above 4,000 meters, in terrain so high and so oxygen-deprived that the air contains barely 60% of what you breathe at sea level. In 2012, a team led by geneticist Chiang Chiu at Lanzhou University published a landmark yak genome study in Nature Genetics. The analysis estimated that domestic yaks diverged genetically from their wild ancestors approximately 300 years ago, roughly 2,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. That timeline places the domestication within the period when the Chiang people of the eastern Tibetan Plateau were transitioning from pure hunting to a mixed economy built around herding. The genome told a deeper story. The genes showing the strongest evidence of selective pressure were not the ones controlling body size or milk yield. They were the genes governing behavior. Specifically, genes linked to brain development and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the hormonal system that controls the fight-or-flight response. What the Chiang herders had been doing, generation after generation, without understanding the genetics, was selecting for calm. They kept the calves that tolerated human proximity, the ones that could be approached without triggering a charge, the ones that did not panic when confined. And over hundreds of generations, this relentless filtering reshaped the yak's neurology from the inside out. Domestic yaks today are about 30% lighter than their wild ancestors, roughly the difference between a motorcycle and a motorcycle carrying a passenger. Their horns are shorter. Their skulls are subtly different in proportion. And their adrenal response, the hormonal cascade that determines whether an animal attacks or flees when a human walks toward it, is fundamentally dampened. Biologists call this cluster of changes the domestication syndrome. It appears in every species humans have ever successfully domesticated, from dogs to sheep to cattle to pigs. Floppy ears, shorter snouts, spotted coats, reduced aggression, juvenile features persisting into adulthood. The Russian geneticist Dmitry Belyaev demonstrated it experimentally starting in 1959 at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, Siberia. By breeding silver foxes purely for tameness, selecting only the individuals that showed the least fear toward handlers, Belyaev's team produced animals that within roughly 10 generations developed floppy ears, curly tails, and piebald coats. None of those physical traits were selected for directly. They arrived linked to the same neural crest cells that also influence adrenal function and aggression. The yak could be domesticated because its wild ancestor carried enough natural variation in temperament that selective breeding could push the population toward human tolerance. Not every wild yak was a candidate, but enough of them, particularly calves raised from birth in proximity to people, could be handled without someone getting killed. And from that narrow opening, 7 millennia of relentless selection produced an animal so deeply embedded in highland life that Tibetan civilization is functionally unimaginable without it. Yak butter tea, called pocha, is consumed in quantities that astonish lowland visitors. Some Tibetan households go through 40 to 60 cups per day, roughly 1 cup every 15 waking minutes. The caloric density of yak butter, combined with the salt used to preserve it, provides critical fat and electrolytes at elevations where the growing season for barley, the only cereal grain that reliably matures above 4,000 meters, lasts barely 90 days. The DZO, a hybrid between a male yak and a domestic cow, is bred at lower altitudes for enhanced milk production while retaining enough high-altitude adaptation to function where no lowland breed survives. This level of deliberate crossbreeding represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, perfected by cultures whose lives depended on getting it right. The Qiang pulled it off. Their descendants refined it across millennia. The entire roof of the world became habitable because of a single domestication event on a frozen plateau surrounded by the highest mountains on Earth. Now turn your attention north. The muskox does not live on a high plateau. It lives on the tundra, the flat, treeless, wind-scoured Arctic steppe stretching across northern Canada, the coastal margins of Greenland, and, following 20th century reintroduction programs, scattered pockets of Alaska, Norway, and Siberia. And the first thing to understand about the MuskOx is that its name is wrong twice. It does not produce musk, and it is not an ox. Molecular phylogenetics places it in the subfamily Caprati, which means it is more closely related to sheep and goats than to any bovine that carries the word ox in its name. European explorers saw a large, shaggy, horned animal standing on the tundra and called it what it looked like. Nobody checked the taxonomy. The muskox's closest living relative is probably the taken, a thick-bodied goat antelope from the bamboo forests of the eastern Himalayas. Two animals that could not look or live more differently, linked by deep molecular kinship. This taxonomic detail matters beyond trivia. The behavioral repertoire of caprines, the goat and sheep family, diverges from bovines in ways that directly affect domesticability. Wild yaks, like other bovines, tend toward flight when threatened. Their default stress response is to create distance. They scatter. They run uphill. They move away from the threat. Muskoxen do the exact opposite. When a predator approaches, adult muskoxen form a defensive circle. They face outward, horns lowered, shoulder to shoulder, with calves sheltered in the center. Each adult in the ring weighs up to 900 pounds, about the weight of a fully loaded commercial refrigerator, and presents a wall of curved horn backed by dense bone and thick muscle. Against wolves, the muskox's primary natural predator, this formation is nearly impenetrable. A wolf that approaches the circle faces a coordinated front of animals that will not break rank, will not scatter, and will not retreat. This defense was refined over more than 600,000 years of Arctic evolution, a span 3 times longer than the entire existence of Homo sapiens as a species. Against pack hunters that kill by separating the vulnerable from the group, it is brilliant. Against humans carrying rifles, it was a death sentence. European and American hunters in the 19th and early 20th centuries discovered that a muskox herd, once it formed its defensive circle in response to gunfire, could be killed to the last animal without a single one breaking formation. The behavior that had protected the species since before modern humans left Africa became the mechanism of its near extinction. By the 1920s, musk oxen had been completely eliminated from Alaska and were critically reduced across much of their Canadian range. They survived in viable numbers only in remote Greenland and a few Arctic islands. Reintroduction to Alaska did not begin until the 1930s, using animals shipped from eastern Greenland. But the defensive circle is more than a historical tragedy. It is the first fundamental barrier to domestication, and the detail that changes the math entirely is this. The muskox's stress response is not flight, it is confrontation. When pressured, when frightened, when approached by something unfamiliar, the muskox does not retreat. It plants its feet, lowers its head, and prepares to charge. Think about what that means for herding. Herding, the foundational act of every pastoral economy in human history, works because the animals move away from pressure. A human approaches from behind, and the herd moves forward. That behavioral assumption underpins everything from Neolithic sheep management to modern cattle ranching operations. Musk oxen violate that assumption at the deepest level. Apply pressure, and they do not move away. They form up and face you. And no, that is not an exaggeration. Every handler who has worked with musk oxen in managed settings confirms it. You cannot drive them. You can sometimes lure them with food. You can sometimes guide them using barriers built heavy enough that they cannot demolish them. But you cannot herd them. The behavioral prerequisite for pastoralism simply does not exist in this species. And the confrontation problem is compounded by a physiological one that makes routine handling not just difficult but frequently lethal. To the animal. Capture myopathy, also called exertional myopathy. When a muskox is chased, restrained, or physically stressed beyond a narrow threshold, its skeletal muscle tissue begins to break down catastrophically. The muscle fibers rupture. Myoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein inside muscle cells, floods the bloodstream and overwhelms the kidneys. The animal enters renal failure. Death can follow within hours. And the damage, once triggered, is often irreversible. The mechanism is thermoregulatory. The muskox's insulation, the same double-layered coat that allows it to survive at -40, where exposed human skin develops frostbite in under 5 minutes, becomes a lethal trap during physical exertion. The animal generates metabolic heat from stress, but cannot shed it fast enough through that dense undercoat. Core temperature spikes. Muscle tissue begins to cook from the inside. Researchers at the Large Animal Research Station at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, particularly veterinary scientist Robert White, documented this repeatedly during handling operations in the 1970s and 1980s. Even routine procedures, tasks as simple as moving an animal between enclosures, triggered fatal stress responses when the ambient temperature climbed above freezing, or when the animal became agitated for more than a few minutes. The margin between a successful handling event and a dead animal was measured in single-digit degrees and minutes of exertion. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense to people hearing it for the first time. Domestication requires handling. It requires separating individuals from the herd to evaluate temperament. It requires transporting animals between breeding groups to prevent inbreeding. It requires close physical contact for veterinary care, for fiber harvesting, for assisting with difficult births. Every single one of these steps triggers the exact physiological response that kills musk oxen. The process of domesticating this animal is, in biological terms, a lethal procedure. But suppose you solved the handling problem. Suppose you developed protocols gentle enough, in temperatures cold enough, to avoid triggering capture myopathy. You would still face the bulls. Male musk oxen become uncontrollably aggressive during the autumn breeding season. Bulls compete for mating access through skull-to-skull combat, charging from distances of up to 50 meters, about half the length of a football field, before slamming their reinforced horn bosses together with an impact that produces a crack audible from over a mile away on open tundra. They repeat these collisions dozens of times per contest. During rut, this aggression does not discriminate between rival males and human handlers. A breeding-age bull muskox will charge fences, vehicles, outbuildings, and people with identical resolve. At the MuskOx farm in Palmer, Alaska, roughly 60 miles northeast of Anchorage, rutting bulls are kept in reinforced enclosures with complete physical separation from all human contact. They cannot be approached. They cannot be contained in standard livestock fencing. The infrastructure required to manage a rutting muskox bull is closer to zoo-grade containment than anything used in conventional agriculture. Compare this with a yak bull during breeding season. Yak bulls are aggressive, yes. But a yak bull can be controlled with a nose ring, a halter, and fencing built to ordinary livestock specifications. The aggression is manageable because the yak retains enough of a flight response that it will generally move away from a human rather than charge forward. The muskox bull does not have that option in its behavioral vocabulary. It lowers its head, it charges, and it does not care whether the target is a rival or a farmer. This is where the human story crashes into the biological one. Because in the early 1950s, a man named John J. Teal Jr. decided that all of this could be overcome. Teal was a Yale-educated businessman from Vermont with a passion for Arctic exploration. He had traveled extensively in northern Canada, observed wild musk ox herds, and handled raw kiviot fiber. He recognized immediately that if kiviot could be harvested from managed animals on any commercial scale, it would create a new economic resource for indigenous Arctic communities with almost no other agricultural options. The fiber was extraordinary, roughly 8 times warmer than sheep's wool by weight. Hypoallergenic. It did not shrink when washed. On the luxury textile market, raw kiviot sold for between $40 and $80 per ounce, several times the price of cashmere. In 1954, Teal brought several muskox calves to his property in Vermont. The calves adapted initially. Young muskoxen, like the juveniles of many large mammals, are more tractable than adults. They accepted bottle feeding and human contact. They grew. But Vermont has summers. And a Vermont summer, while mild by human standards, is far too warm for an animal whose thermoregulatory system was calibrated across more than 500,000 years of Arctic evolution for sustained temperatures of -30 Celsius. The calves overheated. Parasites that could never survive above the Arctic Circle found welcoming hosts in the humid New England climate. Teal recognized quickly that if the project was going to work, it needed to move north. He established the Institute of Northern Agricultural Research and relocated the operation to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Over the following decades, every barrier confirmed itself. The kiviot harvest worked. Each adult animal shed about 3.5 pounds of undercoat fiber naturally during the spring molt, enough to produce several luxury garments. It could be combed out by hand without shearing. The fiber quality exceeded expectations. The economic model was sound. Everything else failed. Bulls became dangerous at sexual maturity without exception, regardless of upbringing. Calf mortality made sustainable herd growth a perpetual struggle. Standard livestock techniques consistently triggered capture myopathy or provoked charges. The handling protocols that worked for every other domesticated species on Earth did not work for muskoxen. And the modified protocols designed specifically for muskoxen still killed a percentage of the animals they were meant to protect. If Teal had quit after the first decade of failures, this would be a story about a businessman who underestimated biology. But he spent the rest of his career on the problem. The MuskOx farm in Palmer, Alaska, which still operates today as a nonprofit, is his direct legacy. The farm maintains approximately 80 animals, fewer than a single herd of wild caribou. Handlers know each animal by name. Every spring, they comb kiviot from the cooperative females and deliver it to the Ummingmak muskox producers, cooperative, where Alaska native knitters transform it into scarves and stoles sold worldwide. The economic success is real. The biological breakthrough never came. If you have been following this channel, you know that the mechanics behind domestication, extinction, and survival follow rules that are more rigid than they first appear. If this is the kind of analysis you come here for, subscribe now. I cover the deep history behind humans and the natural world every week, and the algorithm will stop surfacing this channel unless you tell it to keep going. While Teal was wrestling with MuskOx biology in Alaska, the broader historical record of the Arctic was answering the domestication question from a completely different direction. Because the MuskOx was not the only large herbivore available to Arctic peoples, it was simply the one they never chose. The Inuit, the primary indigenous culture of the North American Arctic, knew musk oxen intimately. They hunted them for meat, used the hides for sleeping robes, carved the horns into tools and implements. But they never attempted domestication. The reason is disarmingly simple. They did not need to. The Inuit had the dog. Domesticated independently in the Arctic from a northern wolf population thousands of years before European contact, the sled dog provided transportation across sea ice and snow with an efficiency that no other animal could match in that environment. And for meat, hides, sinew, and bone, the Inuit had the caribou. Wild caribou herds, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, migrated through Inuit territory twice every year, spring and fall. When a functionally limitless supply of a cooperative animal walks past your camp on a schedule you can predict within days, there is no incentive to wrestle with one that charges you on sight. Across the Bering Strait, the pattern repeated with different cultures and identical results. The Chukchi of northeastern Siberia, the Sami of Scandinavia, and the Nenets of the Yamal Peninsula all developed pastoral economies in the Arctic. Every single one chose the reindeer. Rangifer tarandus, an animal with a flight-based stress response, a manageable temperament outside the rut, a willingness to breed in captivity, a hierarchical social structure that humans could exploit by inserting themselves at the top. The reindeer met every domestication criterion that the musk ox failed. Across thousands of years, across dozens of independent Arctic and subarctic cultures on 3 continents, the verdict was unanimous. Reindeer, yes. Musk ox, no. This was not cultural diffusion. These peoples did not learn the answer from each other. They arrived at it independently, through separate experiments, and reached identical conclusions. The evolutionary biologist Jared Diamond framed this pattern through what he called the Anna Karenina principle. Domesticable animals are all alike. Every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. Successful domestication requires a species to satisfy every item on a strict checklist. Flexible diet, reasonable growth rate, willingness to breed in captivity, manageable temperament, a stress response that does not kill the animal, and a hierarchical social structure that humans can co-opt. The musk ox fails on at least 3 of these criteria: temperament, stress physiology, and social structure, which is the criterion that gets the least attention but may matter the most. Yaks, like cattle, organize around a dominant individual that leads the herd. Humans exploit this by occupying that leadership position. Control the hierarchy, and you control the group. This is how pastoralism works for cattle, yaks, reindeer, sheep, and goats. Musk ox herds during the breeding season are dominated by bulls competing through combat, but the dominant bull does not lead the group in any functional sense. He monopolizes mating while the core herd of females and juveniles operates semi-independently. Outside breeding season, the structure loosens further, with individuals drifting between groups in fluid patterns that resist consistent management. There is no single control point for a human to seize. The hierarchy is too flat, too seasonal, and too diffuse. Belyaev's fox experiment proved that temperament can be altered through selective breeding in surprisingly few generations. If someone had maintained a musk ox breeding program for even 100 years, roughly 15 to 20 musk ox generations, the behavioral baseline might have shifted enough to produce a more tractable population. But that kind of program requires 3 things that never existed simultaneously in the musk ox's range: a human population large enough to sustain the effort, infrastructure stable enough to maintain controlled herds across multiple human generations, and a motivation strong enough to absorb the relentless cost of dead animals and injured handlers. The interior Arctic tundra, where musk oxen ranged, supported a human population density of roughly 1 person per 250 square kilometers before European contact, approximately 1 person for every area the size of a mid-sized city. The Tibetan Plateau, where yaks were domesticated, supported closer to 1 person per 10 square kilometers, 25 times more people per unit of land. The Arctic simply did not have the human numbers to sustain a domestication program, even if the animal had been willing, which it was not. The window for muskox domestication, if it ever truly existed, was vanishingly small. It would have required a large, settled population in the high Arctic, with no access to caribou, reindeer, or dogs, sustained without interruption across centuries. That population never materialized anywhere on Earth, and by the time modern science made a rigorous attempt feasible in the 20th century, the experiment confirmed what every Arctic culture had already concluded independently across millennia of direct experience. Some animals accept the process, the musk ox does not. Today, the Palmer Musk Ox Farm sits on a hillside above the Matanuska Valley, with the snow-covered Chugach Mountains rising behind it. Handlers comb kiviut from socialized females every spring and deliver it to a cooperative where Alaska Native artisans transform one of the rarest natural fibers on Earth into garments sold to collectors worldwide. But those 80 animals are not domesticated, they are tamed. The distinction is not semantic. A tamed animal is an individual wild animal habituated to human presence within its own lifetime. A domesticated animal belongs to a population that has been genetically transformed through generations of selective breeding into something biologically distinct from its wild ancestor. Dogs are domesticated wolves. Domestic yaks are domesticated wild yaks. They are different animals at the genomic level. The musk oxen at Palmer are genetically identical to wild musk oxen on Banks Island or the coast of northeastern Greenland. No domestication syndrome. No floppy ears, no shortened skulls, no dampened adrenal cascades. Just individual animals, raised by human hands from calfhood, that tolerate our presence during their lifetimes. Their offspring, if not hand-raised in the same way, revert to wild behavior within a single generation. 14 million yaks transformed the roof of the world into a human habitat. 80 tamed musk oxen produce exquisite scarves on a hillside in Alaska. The gap between those two outcomes was not determined by human ambition or ingenuity. It was determined by the musk ox's confrontational stress response, by the thermoregulation that kills the animal when you handle it on a warm day, by the geography that placed it in the emptiest human-inhabited landscape on Earth, and by the plain historical fact that every Arctic culture needing a domesticated herbivore found one that cooperated and never looked back. The real question this story raises is not why nobody domesticated the musk ox. The real question is whether domestication is even a meaningful concept for a species whose deepest survival instinct, refined across 600,000 years, is to face the threat, form the line, lower the horns, and hold. Every domesticated animal on Earth descends from a wild ancestor that, at some critical juncture in its evolutionary history, developed a stress response weighted toward retreat, toward yielding ground, toward moving away from the unfamiliar. That instinct, the willingness to flee rather than fight, is the biological prerequisite for herding, for confinement, for every selective breeding decision that domestication demands. The muskox evolved the opposite instinct: face the threat, stand, charge. That choice kept the species alive through ice ages that erased the woolly mammoth, the dire wolf, and dozens of megafauna species that are now nothing but bones in museum drawers. It is the reason musk oxen exist at all, and it is the reason they will almost certainly never be domesticated. The animal that survived the Pleistocene by refusing to run from anything is the same animal that resists domestication by refusing to run from us. After 7 decades of organized scientific effort, from a Vermont farmhouse to a research station in Fairbanks to a hillside in Palmer, the evidence leads to a single conclusion. That refusal is not a defect, it is the defining adaptation of the species, and it is not going anywhere. If you want to see more content like this, click the video on screen now.